25 years ago. And at first, right, we focus on rights of students experiencing homelessness or unstably housed. So throughout the 25 years, we have had more capacity to take on more cases, and Alyssa can talk a little bit about that.
So our main kind of way we do direct services is through our Youth Futures Project, which launched in 2004 and was part of an Equal Justice Works Fellows project. And so through that, we do civil legal rights for unaccompanied homeless youth through outreach at youth drop-in centers and at high schools and family shelters as well. Some of the issues that we work with are public benefits, helping with access to SNAP and Medicaid and SSI, IDs and various documents that are needed, sealing and expungement of cannabis and some other criminal matters, employment, housing, and then we still have a big focus on access to education, preschool through college for students experiencing homelessness.
And throughout this time that we'll be presenting, these are the different points that we will be going through. So next slide. So we will start, well, the goals of our presentation, right, is focusing on client interviewing. So really understanding what it looks like to build trust, establishing next steps with your clients, obtaining relevant and accurate information, and also creating a practice that's incorporating a holistic and client-centered perspective in order for you all to grow as attorneys in the field. So with that, next slide. Client interview settings, so common interview methods, right, that you all potentially will connect with a client, whether it's Zoom with COVID-19. That was like a big, we utilize Zoom a lot, but we also use phones, in person, intakes on the street, so meeting clients where they're at. And then also just in community settings. So whether it's drop-in centers, family shelters, et cetera, that is where, for us, that's where we conduct our interviews. And with that, I actually manage the phone intake line, and social work students and also other staff members assist with that. And when it comes to a phone interview, right, understanding and establishing like who you are and your role. So even if they call you, they might not fully comprehend the legal aid that you provide. So just, a quick, hi, my name is Christy Beretta. I'm from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. These are the civil legal aid issues that we assist with. How can we help you? So as simple as kind of, very basic, saying what you and your organization does. If they're like, I just got this phone call or I just got this number, what do you all do, right? And then also too, a lot of our clients, they call and an intake takes around 20 minutes. So with that, it's really important to, ask them if they have the space to answer some questions. Sometimes clients are, dropping off their kids or they're in public transportation, right? So really understanding that there needs to be confidentiality in that space, and sometimes like they can't answer questions for 20 minutes. So making sure you give them the choice of, is it okay if we talk for 20 minutes? And if not, right, just kind of asking when we can schedule a time that's best for them. Again, making sure that it's their choice and their time, right? And then also when a client calls on the phone, sometimes they really want to tell you what's going on, just because sometimes there's, they've called 10 organizations and no one has picked up the phone. So right, there's a lot of information overload sometimes, and that's totally okay. But also like the way we approach it, right, is like if they start talking about their issue, making sure like, putting a pause and saying, we will get to your, to the issue, just wanted to get some basic information from you before then, just your name, number, etc. So, just guiding them through that interview process, right? To making sure you're getting the basic information. And also, again, like sometimes it's really hard to control. And I think as, new attorneys or new folks interviewing clients, like that was a challenge for me to kind of redirecting and making sure that flow of the interview works really well to where the client feels comfortable, but also for you to get the information that you need, right? So with that, just obtain basic information first and then ease into the client interview itself. And also one thing that I just wanted to highlight is when you are connecting with clients, never promise them any service unless you can actually do it. That is the biggest thing, is like never, ever, ever promise, because like that is just really heartbreaking when you have to tell your client that you can't help them, but then you promised, right? So that is like one big thing that I, let everyone know, like our interns know, that's something that's really important in this work. So video interviewing, it's pretty much very similar, right? Some things that I just wanted to point out. Is that sometimes when it comes to video interviewing, if a client is working directly with a provider, so a case manager at a space, and they can't come to your office, this is a really great option. Again, it's pretty much the same basic things that, you want to establish who you are, what you do, getting that information that you need. But also, meet them where they're at in the space, right? Sometimes the Wi-Fi is cutting off. So letting them know, like, I'll be on video, but it's okay if you turn your video off, right? Or sometimes like there's a pet or etc. that's there. Just making sure also that they feel comfortable in that space. So like, hey, I noticed that there are a couple of people around. Is this an okay time to Zoom? And if not, then you can connect with them some other time and giving them that option again. And then also, again, like that connects with confidentiality, right? Like making sure that if there's folks in the background, like they're okay with, answering questions that might be sensitive information. So again, just like connecting with the clients first, if you notice those things in the background, so.
So for in-office interviews, which is probably the majority of, how you'll be meeting with clients typically, you always want to make sure before even scheduling it that the client has a way to get to your office, right? Because if you're going to schedule a meeting, but they just realistically don't have a method or a mode of transportation or can't physically access transportation, it's just going to lead to frustration. And so then that's when you need to utilize other tools like a Zoom or phone call. And make sure that you actually talk to your client about what their plan is, right? If they're going to take public transportation, do they have money on their venture card? Is that something your organization helps with, or is it not? And if they can't get to your office, then finding also an alternative place to meet, if that also works. There's different comfort levels with entering like a corporate setting. So for instance, with our office, there's a front desk that you have to talk to before you can actually get up into our office. So prepare your client for that, because maybe they've had bad experiences being kicked out of buildings or negative experiences with people at front desks. So explain to them that that's the process. And as well, when you're in your office, the person at the front desk, you can let them know like, hey, we're having someone come in 30 minutes, so that they also understand the situation. Travel to and from, again, it can cost money, and so discussing that, making sure that that's also something that's reasonable, and not being afraid to make sure that there's clarity on that. And also understanding what your organization can provide and what it can't. Unfamiliarity with the location can also be a big deal. So typically, right, if a client is coming to you, it's because they're in a stressful time period. They're going through something difficult. And a big trigger can be having to go to someplace new, right? If our office is located downtown, if they're not used to downtown, and that might be really overwhelming to them. So explaining that, what kind of location is your office in? Do they understand how the L trains work or the bus system works? And are they going to be okay with that? Also talking about barriers to accessing your building, right? Are they gonna be able to get in if they have a wheelchair or some other tool that helps them be mobile? Or is that gonna create, a barrier or make them uncomfortable? Figuring that out beforehand so that you're not putting your client in a stressful situation. Something else to think about when you're meeting with clients, they're not always going to be able to find childcare, right? And so figuring out and asking them, right, is there going to be other people who come with you, and do you have a space in your office that's going to allow for more than one person, right? And is going to be accessible for kids, or if there's someone else that is with them. And then be very clear about the time frame for the client, so they know this is most likely going to take this amount of time. So that if they have something else that's going on, if they need to call out for work, and then respect that as well. So if you say this is going to take 30 minutes and that's what they prepare for, then that's when the meeting needs to end, unless there's some other circumstance that happens. And then I also want to talk about meeting on the streets. So sometimes we meet clients on the streets because we work with folks who live in tent encampments, or that just might be the situation you find yourself in. And it's sometimes necessary. And so first thing is just being prepared so that that's not a barrier to getting the legal service that your client needs. Always gauge the client's comfort level. Right, when we were doing work over by the viaducts near Uptown, that was where the clients' homes were, right? They were comfortable there. And so moving them or asking them to meet somewhere else would have been challenging. And so figuring out where is your client the most comfortable with, and seeing where your flexibility is. Always asking them if it's a good time to talk. This is what Christy mentioned, but that really sets up a level of mutual respect when you're making sure that the client is actually in a space where they can talk to you, right? If they are busy with something, even if you've made the time to go down there, something might have come up for them, and it's not going to be a productive conversation if they're not really in the space to talk. And so you just always want to make sure that they're okay to talk, that they're comfortable, and that you can figure out another time if they are not. Exclude others when necessary in order to ensure confidentiality and create a respectful space. This can be hard on the street, but there's still ways where you can make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality. And sometimes too, which can be a tricky situation, they might be someone who always kind of has someone with them. And so really asking them, like, is it okay if this person steps aside, and being clear about that so they know that this conversation is between you and them and no one else. You can also suggest relocating or rescheduling a follow-up interview in the office. So sometimes you need to meet someone on the street to get the basic information of what's going on, right? What is the service they need? Is this, an emergency? Are there forms that need to be filled out? So setting up that initial one, but then figuring out a time where you can have that more in-depth one when you can be in an office that's a little more private. So the other place that I mentioned we meet with clients is community settings. So we meet with clients at schools, shelters, drop-in programs, coffee shops, fast food places, public libraries. So a couple kind of unique things with that. Always ask if there is a way for it to be private, right? So I do legal clinics at schools. So one of the first thing I always do is ask the social worker who we're usually engaging with, is there an office that's not being utilized? Is there a space where there can be privacy for this student to talk to me? If you go, and sometimes that's not the case, and so making sure too that the client really understands that. Are they comfortable having this conversation at a coffee shop? Because that just might realistically be the only place you can have it, but just making sure they understand that and they're comfortable to talk. If you are meeting at a coffee shop or a food place, you should always be prepared to buy food or coffee. Especially because if it's someone who's on the street, or it's a youth or a young person, it might have been a while since they ate. And that can be really hard to be talking about something challenging or traumatic or hard and also be really hungry. So just something to be prepared for. Ask your organization, do they have gift cards? Is that something they can help with? But just something to always kind of keep in mind. And then two, when you're working in community programs, just always make sure that you are connected to at least one person, whether that's the social worker or like the barista or the librarian, but just making sure they kind of have a deep understanding of what you're doing there, why you're there, why this person's there. Just usually makes things go like smoother, and they're usually really like typically like open to that, and that just helps the process. And I think, one thing that we're really about, and I think that will make you a great lawyer, is you always want to think about the community. So you always want to think about where can you meet someone where you're actually meeting them where they're at and where they're going to feel the most safe, the most comfortable. And that's not always going to be in the typical way that would make you necessarily think that. So it's always good to be creative and thoughtful when you're trying to get that information from a client to help them.
So some tips for us, starting the interview. So next slide. Some things to consider, right? Like if a client speaks another language, really understanding, for yourself, with the resources and policies that your agency has, right? Like if there's translation services, and also too, like if you can just try to even just get their name and their phone number, and then try to relay that we'll call back like as soon as possible. I know for us, sometimes like, asking, like also understanding that like if someone's struggling to respond and they mention that they speak Spanish, right? You can like ask if they prefer to continue in Spanish, and we can call them back with somebody in our office who speaks Spanish, right? Or if there is a protocol around translation services, we can get different languages. I know for our organization, we're connected to a place where they offer a ton of different languages around translation. So again, like making the client feel comfortable. And also too, I've had it where a child calls for their parents, right? And that is like a big burden on the child. So making sure that you can like let them know that we can call them back, because like not necessarily like a child should be, doing the intake with you, especially if it is a lot, it's a lot of burden and it's a lot of responsibility for that child, if the parents only speak that language. So again, having accessible and thinking through what this looks like for your organization, or asking, like, are there any protocols when it comes to this? And then, right, when you start an interview, I've already said this, biggest thing is just introducing yourself, understanding, right, your name, position, organization, your pronouns, and also too, when it comes to clients in any space, asking them what their preferred name and pronouns are, right? Just a sign of respect, inclusivity, and also just not assuming, and just kind of normalizing of asking those things right away when starting an interview.
So also when you start an interview, it's always a really good idea to take some time to explain confidentiality, especially I think when you're working with youth or young people, explaining, obviously you don't have to go into extreme detail of what like the actual policy or law is, but that what they share with you is not going to be shared outside of it, that there are these legal protections, so that they feel safe to be able to really explain to you what's going on. And this is also something that I would say should be reiterated. I've had a lot of clients where we've been working together for a while, and then, the day before a hearing or something, they tell me something that they haven't told me before because they still had that fear of, saying whatever it was. So I think that's something that's just a good reminder at the beginning and at the end to say that, this is confidential, that this is, for the purpose of this, the service you're trying to provide them, and it's not going to be shared. Encourage your client to ask questions. I think a lot of times people are fearful, especially if they're dealing with something they're unfamiliar with, right? Maybe they've never dealt with this type of issue before, and they feel like they don't know what's going on. So make sure you really give them space, and reiterate that they can ask questions, that, you're working together, that this is a team, that you're trying to provide this service, but they, you want them to have a good understanding of what's going on. So also something to just reiterate. So you always want to be kind of one of the main focuses of what Christy and I have been talking about is you always want to be client centered. So, you get the basic information that you're going to need to continue this conversation. So their phone number, their address, their date of birth. But also you want to balance this. Like you don't want to just go into a meeting and say, okay, what's your name, what's your date of birth, what's your social security card? All this information might freak them out, especially if they've had a bad experience, right? So you want to be thoughtful when you're engaging them, making sure that you're kind of giving them the information like Christy and I talked about, explaining who you are, explaining your organization, explaining why you're meeting, that this is confidential, so that by the time you get those information, they've had a chance to kind of settle in. And don't feel like this is something that you need to I think sometimes, and I do this as an attorney, we know the information we need to get, so we kind of just want to rush to it. But that sometimes can actually be really damaging down the road with that client-attorney relationship. So taking your time. And something else that I've definitely learned and talked to Christy a lot about, sometimes what I don't think is sensitive to a client. Right? Because I haven't experienced maybe what they've experienced. So for instance, asking a client their date of birth for their child, because I help students enroll in school. So that's a typical thing I ask. But if a parent has had a bad situation with maybe their student's information being, taken, or they might be hesitant to give their date of birth of their child. And so, maybe I don't think of that necessarily. So taking the time to think through that and explain why you're getting the information you're getting, why it's needed, and not getting information that's not needed either. Understanding what you need and what you don't. So during the interview, the first thing, which sounds simple, but can actually be really hard for attorneys, is use clear and simple language. And this is hard because a lot of what we're working with is complicated laws that's written in legalese and meant to be understood by attorneys. But it can be so overwhelming for a family if you're using words and terminology and explaining stuff in a way that they don't understand. So before going into the interview, think through that, right? How would you explain this in a way that's clear and simple, that is accurate, that they're going to be able to fully grasp? And the way I always think about it is when you go to a doctor's appointment, right? I get so overwhelmed if a doctor is using all these words that I'm not familiar with. So always think through that when you're talking to your client. Ask open-ended questions. So let the client provide the narrative. Again, I think sometimes we have a thought of okay, I know I need to know this basic information for this case, or this is what I'm trying to prove. But sometimes you can gain so much more by letting those open-ended questions and letting the client explain it from their point of view. And then you can ask follow-up and clarifying questions, but letting them share is really important. And not only just for the case, but for your client-attorney relationship, because most likely your clients had a negative experience where they don't feel heard. So letting them tell their story is going to be helpful. Understand that some clients may be seeking help from various sources. You might not be the only organization they're working with or they've talked to. It could be other legal aid providers, a social work friend, caseworker, even an alderman. So ask that, right? Figure out who else have they talked to about this so that you get a better understanding of the full situation. Making sure you always have multiple forms of contact. This is even more critical, I think, during the pandemic and in the season of the pandemic we're in now, because people's phone numbers change and they can't always get into their emails. And so making sure you get multiple ways and figuring out, we always ask, is there a caseworker you feel comfortable that talking to, right? That we could get a phone number if we need to reach out to you. Is there someone in your life where if something happens to your contact information, we could get that's going to be so useful, especially if it's a longer case. Like an SSI case can take a really long time. So getting those multiple forms of contact is super important. And like I said too, don't be afraid to use the resources the client has. Meaning, right, if they have a social worker, a teacher, a caseworker, if they have other people in their life that they feel comfortable with, ask that, right? And figure that out, because that might be a really good source of contact. So on the next one, something that happens a lot, like what happens if a client gives you more information than you need? Which, like I said, a lot of the times you're working with clients who haven't felt heard, who are really frustrated. And sometimes they'll just want to share everything. And that just can be really challenging. So a good way to kind of start it is, one, don't get frustrated. So you stay calm, even if they are sharing a lot of things that you know are not relevant to the case. Kind of an example of what you can say is, I understand that there are a lot of details you want me to know, but can you tell me this, whatever it is that is really necessary? And explain to them why you want to focus on that, why that's important, why what they're saying is still important, but might need to be saved for a next time. And also make sure to, when you're asking a question, if a client goes on a tangent, go back and say, do they really understand what you're asking, right? And think through that. Because maybe they're not understanding it the way you've asked it. So try to re-ask the question. Try to figure out so that you can get to the information you need to. And then also figure out what are the factors that are just preventing this comprehension. So it could be language, it could be the speed of which you're talking, it could be the setting, right? If I'm in a space that looks like a DCFS office, I'm going to have a difficult time talking to my client because they've probably had a bad experience. Or, right, if they're really hungry, or if they have so many other things in their mind. So I know I recently had a client, I was trying to get their child enrolled in school, but the parent just kept focusing on the fact that her SNAP, her link card wasn't working. Right? So that getting basic food was more important than getting their child enrolled, because they knew the food was needed for survival. And so also think through that, right? If they are hyper focusing on something else in all your questions, even if it's not related, maybe that needs to be addressed first. And then get as much information as possible, because it might be hard to meet up again, and be very concrete with your next steps. Don't make it ambiguous, because their schedule might be really hard, and you want to make sure that you are staying online to address whatever their issue is.
And also too, so obviously within our interdisciplinary team, we have social workers and attorneys, and community lawyering and some theories of social work really intertwined. So one of the things that are really important for us, especially when we're thinking through client interviewing, is most motivational interviewing. So you can read a little bit about it here, but also too, in connection to client interviewing, there are skills within motivational interviewing that's called OARs, and you can develop to connect with your client. So O stands for open-ended questions, right? It's really important to get the details, and when you have questions that can lead to X, Y, and Z, that is so much easier than a yes or no. And then A, affirmations, right? Understanding that it's really, really hard to ask for help, right? So if there's something that, they came into the office today and they told you that it was going to be really hard for them to get childcare, like, acknowledging that priority, or saying like, thank you for meeting with me and taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it, right? Or just like reflective listening and really understanding what they're saying, and throughout the conversation. Really understanding that, like, you're on the same page around the issues that they want, the priorities that they need, right? And then also at the end, this is really important, is again, right, like being in the same page around, like, if they have X, Y, and Z that they said to you that are issues, like, asking them what is the most priority, and then saying that to them, right? Like, this is what you told me today before I let the team know. Is there anything else that you want to add, right? And asking them, like, does this sound good? So if not, then you can add on, and just kind of making sure that you're both in the same level when it comes to, what their needs are and the next steps, like Alyssa mentioned in the other slides, just around like closing out the interview. And then also a big thing, right, is listening and don't judge. And this is really important to trust and establish rapport with clients. And also just demonstrating concern, right? And also this is just really important just because of fully understanding what the client is saying in the moment. And right, like I'm sure that the client, as Alyssa mentioned, there's a ton of factors in their life. And as an attorney, you're balancing a lot of cases probably. So just making sure that, 20 minutes, just being present. And sometimes that's much harder than saying it. So really, practicing it when you are working with clients. And then, right, like nonverbal cues are really important. Nodding, eye contact, leaning forward, but also with the leaning forward, just making sure that you also have enough space for you and the client, because again, that might be triggering for them. So also, again, the affirmations, like I see, I know, using I statements, right? And then again, the biggest thing is just unconditional positive regard. So just basic acceptance and support of a person, regardless of what they have said or done, right? And just making sure that, again, like we really say client-centered approach, but this is really what we mean by that, as part of it is just like active listening and unconditional positive regard.
So starting the interview and how you start it is super important, but also how you finish it. So the probably most important thing, which I think as a young attorney, you're going to hear a lot, is manage expectations, right? So a client is meeting with you about something that matters to them, something that's serious, and probably something that's like consuming their minds. And so they want it dealt with quickly. And we know our systems don't always work that way. And so like Christy mentioned earlier, if you promise your client that this is going to get resolved in 30 days and it doesn't, even if that's outside of your control, that is going to be really hard. So, right, explain to them that these systems take a while, that, this is that you can give, if you, have been doing SSI work a lot or public benefits work a lot, and you have an understanding of what typically the time is, you can explain that typically this is how long it's going to last or how long it's going to take, but then also make sure you're setting that it could be longer, that there are things that happen that I'm going to keep you updated, so that they leave knowing, not having an expectation that's going to be more burdensome from them because it's not realistic. Explain to the client what you can and can't do. This happens a lot to us, if we have a client who we're able to get their child enrolled in school, and then we're also able to, set them up on public benefits, and we give them some case management, and we do a couple of things, and then they come back to us with something that's really outside of our capacity. But at that point, they sort of think we can help them with anything. And that can be really frustrating for them. So, make sure you're really clear what you can do, what you can't do, and explain that process. And also make sure that they understand it, not just that you're saying it, but that they get what you're actually saying. Establish when they will hear from you again and any information or action that's needed. And this is something that I still work on a lot, but you have to be as clear as you can. If you tell them you're going to follow up in a week, you need to follow up in a week. And I know Christy's really good at this, that she'll put those in her calendar of like, call this person on this date. And so figure out what strategy works best for you, right? My brain is unorganized, so I have to try to do that as well, of being like, okay, I need to email this person back on this day. I told them they would hear from me on this day. So that, you are being honest with them and they are expecting, what you say ends up being the reality. And if you can't get a hold of them, then you know that you're following up with a caseworker or someone else. As for personal information at the end of your interview, so after you've kind of built trust, you can, if there are sensitive things you need, like a social security number, it's a good time after you've kind of built that trust and you can explain, you know, why you need that for this case or this hearing. And that can, I think, be helpful because then they kind of understand that you've listened to them, that you've heard from them, that their kind of priorities matter.
And then we just wanted to add some other things at the end of this that's really important within our work as an organization, as a law project. One of the things, and especially I'm the racial equity chair at the coalition, and I work directly with the director of equity and transformation. So with that, we kind of just wanted to shift that conversation into kind of just seeing, you know, like what the work looks like at a legal aid or at an organization that is centering racial equity within their work. So this is our definition at Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And then how does that connect to our work with clients? As you probably know, people experiencing homelessness are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color. CCH has turned 43, and it's almost 8 years doing this work and trying to center this work at the forefront in all parts of whether it's legal, advocacy, organizing throughout, you know, internally and externally as an organization, whether it's doing a racial equity assessment, when we are, you know, working through what types of supports or legal aid that we might support our clients, or a type of campaign that we want to do, right? Really seeing it in that lens. And also, like within the next couple of slides, it's kind of bringing back the focus on us, right, as practitioners, whether you're an attorney or a staff within the law project or any space, right, in public interest or anywhere. With that, Naya Kelly, who is the director of transformation and equity at CCH, she actually teaches a class at Loyola, and she was okay with like kind of sharing like an activity or like a highlight of some of like what she does with her students as an attorney in that space. So one of the things that she does is really focusing on implicit bias as a starting point, right? And what is implicit bias? The definition is right there. But with that, like many organizations, our racial equity work at the coalition started when folks wanted to take space to talk about what was happening across the country, Black and brown people dying at the hands of the police. The death of Alton Sterling in the summer of 2016 was a precipice in wanting to do something at CCH to address and fight racial injustices as an organization. So while like we weren't there at that time, the staff really spent time meeting and discussing what we can do as an organization, what we can do in our own practice within our jobs, right, as professionals. Again, like this work is important because people experiencing homelessness are disproportionately BIPOC. And according to Housing Action Illinois, despite making up 14% of the population of the state, Black Illinoisans make up 30% of residents experiencing poverty and 59% of residents experiencing homelessness. So, you know, understanding the data, understanding the clients, and understanding how you can really, you know, center racial equity around your practice is really important. And again, like this is just a starting point. So next slide. And with that, right, like expressions of implicit bias towards individuals, these are some things in comparison, right? And understanding and knowing like the power and privilege that you have, like even as an attorney in that space, even, you know, but also understanding the impact of your behaviors when you're working with clients. This is really important because, right, like one is just very closed off and then the other is open, right? And with that, it's really connected to, you know, establishing that rapport, understanding that, you know, there are different levels of privilege and power in the space when you are working with clients. So this is again the implicit bias, and Naya, she has her class do this implicit bias tool assessment. And it's, we just put it on here just like as a, if you wanted to do it yourself. There's a race-specific implicit bias, but then you can also add different types of factors as well. And usually it's like 2, and then this is just an example of like what work you can do for yourself as, a young attorney, especially in public interest or any space, right? Because this affects everybody. And then also just self-reflection questions around this in order to further your work around equity. So. And then, yeah, like, I think, like, again, like, this is just a starting point of, like, understanding and learning about implicit bias is to start in taking action around equity, right? I think we were just discussing how sometimes, like, organizations like to put, like, statements around what they are going to do if something happens around racial injustices. But again, like, really understanding that, like, there needs to be action taken from the organization, but also, like, if you're committed to racial equity work, you have to really reflect on yourself and also, in your practice. And it starts with us. And then also, right, like naming and understanding history and how, even in the social work profession, my background's in social work, in, law, right, and organization perpetuates and is connected to white supremacy and racism. So really understanding those things and taking a step back as well when it comes to racial equity. And then Alyssa can add to that.
Yeah, so I think something that's really important is this comes at all levels of practice. It's not just in our work with our clients, but it's in the little things of how things get written and the words that are used and the advocacy approaches. And as in legal aid, it's disproportionately white attorneys. So when you're talking, like Christy said, about the data that disproportionately our clients will be people of color, it is our job as white attorneys to learn and to think through implicit biases and to do the work and to address our own issues with racism. It's not on our peers or on our colleagues of color, but it's on us, and it's a lifelong responsibility if we really want to serve our clients and our communities well. And there are so many amazing resources out there to learn from and to think through. And this, like I said, this work is lifelong. I think sometimes in legal aid, and I say we, including me as well, it's easy to get in this mentality of like, we're doing good work, like this isn't something that we're struggling with, but it is. And it can be really detrimental even if what we're thinking is good, if we're not doing the work. And I think especially as attorneys, when we're dealing with clients, there's this inherent power dynamic that comes with that. And that is so deeply rooted in white supremacy and something that you always need to think through. The power dynamics of every time you enter a room, and be thoughtful about that and always be checking that when you're doing your work. And this slide has some just good resources that I've read that other people have recommended to me, and can be a good place to think through when you're thinking about racial equity in law. And so I highly recommend looking at these and thinking through them.
And then our next piece is trauma-informed care as well. So really like this quote, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. So really understanding and engaging and connecting in that moment with a client, as mentioned before, active listening, right? And then the interactions are valuable to build rapport, and also just, your client attorney relationships. And also just, this could be, you know, recommendation that if there is a training or a class at your school, you know, trauma-informed care, racial equity, those things are just like, these are just little snippets. There could be a different training, right, to really dig deep into that work. So when working with Black, Indigenous people of color and vulnerable populations, you'll encounter clients who have experienced various types of trauma, whether that's racial trauma, intergenerational trauma, and also, right, like experiencing homelessness is traumatic in itself. So with that, this lens is really important. And then tips of handling trauma, right? If a client discusses a traumatic situation with you, again, you know, affirming them to, you know, like, thank you so much for sharing with me. I just really appreciate that you feel comfortable discussing this situation, or something to that effect, right? And just, it's really important to hold space for that client. And then just, again, that strength-based approach would, like, you know, if a client discusses with you just a really traumatic experience, you know, it's okay, like, if you're just listening, right? It's okay if there's silence. I think for me, like, when I was first, like, a social worker working with clients, sometimes it's really hard, like, not to talk, when, you know, like, again, like, wanting to get those questions answered, etc. But it's also like a beautiful thing to sit with the silence and giving the client, you know, especially since, like, they're sharing something so vulnerable with you, just to sit into that, right? Lean into that. Because sometimes, like, you know, the 10 minutes or the 5 minutes that they're explaining this, they've never shared it with anyone. So just kind of thinking through, you know, like, it took a lot of courage. It took a lot for that client to really, you know, like, feel safe enough to share that situation.
So, something that you will 100% encounter is interviewing or talking with a client who is angry, who is upset. And as Christy said, right, we're dealing with clients often who have experienced trauma, and a common approach to that is anger. Oh, sorry, did I know?
No, I think I missed it.
Yeah,
It's my bad.
Good. So a common emotional response to that is anger, and that could be expressed towards you, right, as the attorney. So I think one thing that Christy said that I always go back to is always start with treating everyone with positive regard. If you come with that mindset, it's going to make it so much easier to deal with someone who is upset. And then always think, if someone is meeting with you, it's because they've been wronged, right? Or they feel they have been wronged, or someone they love has been wronged. And so if you realize that it's not about you, it's about something that has happened to them and that they are processing. And so a lot of the times their anger is an expression of that, and that's okay. Also think that the questions you're asking, they could be really difficult, and that could cause anger. So even though as an attorney, you might need to get that information to assist and help the client, that doesn't mean that the questions you're asking are any easier for a client to answer. And the other thing is, you might get this sensitive information from a client, right? It might be hard for them to talk to you. They might have taken off work to come and meet with you, and then the end result might be that you can't help them. And that's really hard, even if that is not your fault. And even though to figure out if you could help them or not, you had to ask those questions, right? You had to take the time to meet with them. That's hard. And so I think if you can stop there and just understand that, it's gonna make dealing with the process a lot easier. So it's always important to stay calm, right? Just because someone else's emotional response might be high does not mean yours needs to be. Don't take it personally. It really, most of the time, is going to have very little to do with you. Try to empathize as much as you can, with still understanding that you may have never experienced what they're experiencing. And then, I can't say this enough, ask for help. So I talk to Christy a lot. If I have clients who have yelled at me. I've had clients who hang up or who storm out. And I almost always ask Christy if I'm going to meet with them again. What are some good approaches? What could I do? So if you have a social worker at your agency, or you have an experienced attorney who has had some trauma training, ask for help. I think as attorneys and as law students, we kind of want to show that we know what we're doing, not like we're confident and we're in control, and our clients expect us to be confident and in control, but ask for help. So that because attorneys are not trained on trauma typically, right? So we might not understand how all of that works. And so figuring that out could be so helpful. And I know there's been so many times where I've had clients that were there were difficult situations, and talking to Christy and thinking through it made our next time much more productive. And so, talking to your supervisor, figuring out, again, what resources your organization has, what trainings are available, can make it so much easier. Some other tips is to think about refocusing the client. So I know sometimes when like I said, I'm our education attorney, so most of my work is getting students into school. So if, my goal is to get this child re-enrolled in school, but there also was a bullying incident, or there was some other incident at school, and the parent might be hyper-focused on that because it was really hard and that's causing them to be angry, I always try to separate it and say, okay, so what we're talking about today is getting your child re-enrolled in school. This is still this other incident that I can understand you want to talk about. We can also talk about, but let's set up our own time to talk about that. So refocusing on what the actual issue that you've come to meet. And I think a lot of that can also happen when you schedule the initial meeting, making it, like we said, very clear what that topic is going to be if you are able to. Ask the person if they need a few minutes, right? I know that we have a lot of clients and our time is limited, but that sometimes can be so much more productive. If you ask your client, do you need a few minutes? Do you need me to get you a glass of water? Do you need me to step out for a little bit? Can be really helpful to let that person recenter, to kind of calm down, to be in that silence, to breathe, then can make the rest of your conversation a lot more productive. Typically, and this is something Christy's definitely taught me, if you remain calm and neutral and your breathing is steady, a lot of the times it's going to calm down the other people in the room. So just be thoughtful of that, right? And if you need a minute to go calm down, that's also okay to tell your client you need to step out for, 30 seconds. Take that deep breath so you can come back with an energy that's calm. Don't raise your voice. Don't raise your voice to argue with them, even if it's really hard. It is so much better to stay silent until you can speak in a neutral tone, because that is just not going to be productive. And don't join in the rant. And this can be hard because sometimes what your client is ranting about, you agree with, right? And you see the injustice and you want to demonstrate to them that you're on their team. But sometimes that can just fuel the fire and make it so your conversation and the goal of you and the client isn't going to be reached. And you're just going to be getting information that isn't needed and might be more triggering or harmful for the client.
We put this quote up just because it really centers around like self-care and also taking care of yourself. I know, when I was in school, and also you all are in law school, doing internships, all of the things, self-care goes out the window, right? But also, like, really, as new attorneys, it's really important, if you don't have boundaries, self-care, or really understanding what that looks like for yourself, it's really, really important. Just because, getting into this work, I'm sure it's because you really want, you're a selfless person, right? Public interest, like getting into legal aid in this space, there's a lot of attorneys that are very selfless, and we're always bound, like there's so many different cases, etc., right? But also understanding that like there's also boundaries, right? Understanding that there's space. and also just like taking space for practice. So that was like a really good quote. So if you see it later, Artie's gonna send out the presentation. You can read it, but also too, like this is a really good book, Trauma Stewardship, right? That bearing witness concept, that there is inherent value to bearing witness in injustice and trying to help even if you can't solve the problem, right? A lot of times clients come and there are a lot of traumas, or there's just a lot of really hard situations. So making sure that like your health is really important, right? Your physical and mental health to really continue this work for a really long time so you don't burn out. I always tell this to like our interns, especially when you're new in your practice, like it's just really hard. Like, what are boundaries? What is self-care, right? Like, it's not like, you know, going on a shopping spree or eating at a really nice restaurants every weekend. Totally cool, but like also, you know, really understanding that like self-care comes from the normal day-to-day. Are you eating, like taking 30 minutes to eat? Are you drinking your water a couple times a day, you know? Or just like turning off, like if it's a really hard call, like can I shut my phone off for 5 minutes because I just need to go and get like a water or something like that, right? Really understanding the value of doing little things throughout your day to really keep your, you know, mental health and physical health good, because like if we are sick, we can't do this work, right? And it's really detriment to our clients. So I always really preach like understanding boundaries and understanding little things that can get you through a really difficult day. Like for me, that is really self-care in itself. And again, it's a really when you're in public interest, like it's lifelong work and working with really difficult situations with clients in any space, right? So really understanding like this is also really important in your practice and what this looks like. And I know we're running out of time, so we'll just skip. And then Alyssa will talk about this last part.
So I'll go through this really quick. I know that in law school you talk about confidentiality, and I just want to emphasize how important it is, especially when you are dealing with clients who are scared, who have been hurt by systems. So know these rules, honor them, respect them, and realize that that attorney-client relationship is so important to successfully advocating for your clients. Understanding when confidentiality gets broken, and when it's upheld, who can be in the room, just know them, because I think sometimes as public interest attorneys, we want to help our clients so much, which is great, but that sometimes makes us not as focused, I think sometimes, on thinking through what those hard rules are. And so know them, love them, honor them, and make sure your clients also understand them.
I think it's just all confidentiality.
Yeah.
So that's it for us. Thank you so much for joining in. And if you have any questions, etc., I know we're running out of time. We could probably answer a couple, but if not, here's all our information. And we also do have public interest public interest interns as well, and also like fellowships and etc. So you can reach out if this is an organization you want to work for. Cool. I think that's it.
All right, everyone. I will be sitting around these slides later today, so if you do come up with any other questions, you can go ahead and send them to them directly, and they'd be happy to answer. Just similar to orientation, this is very important work, very important concepts to keep in mind when performing your interviews, and I'm sure some of you have already started getting into that, and you're seeing some of these things, so just keep them in mind. The slides are a great reference, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to Alyssa or Christy or even me at Pili, and I can be happy to help you or even connect you with other resources. Thank you.